Hello, and welcome to another great episode of Truth Wanted. I am your host, as always, Objectively Dan. Today is November 9th, I believe, 2018, and joining me today on this fabulous day is the one and only host of the Naked Mormonism podcast, Bryce Blankenagel. Bryce, what is up, my dude?
Dan, I'm super stoked to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
Yes. So in case you don't know what that is, Bryce has a podcast where he talks about the history of Mormonism in great detail. I'm a fan of it myself. He's been doing it for a couple of years now, and he's been involved with some other projects as well. I was recently on his channel for a special Patreon video for just hanging out with him. We got to talk about street epistemology and some other stuff. So you should definitely check that out on his channel. But tell us else about your podcast and like what else you like to do in the community.
Yeah, so I actually do 3 different podcasts. I co-host a couple of other podcasts. It's all Mormon related, and even the term Mormon now is considered derisive by the Mormon Church. But I'm still happy to call Mormons Mormon. But yeah, so I began studying church history about 5 years ago now, and I just couldn't get enough of it and decided to start a podcast all about it, which has led me into the foray of Mormon history and the atheist communities. And I kind of danced the line of ex-Mormonism and various versions of Mormonism, including believing Mormonism, as well as, kind of spend a lot of time with the atheist communities and consume podcasts and YouTube channels over on that side as well. I've been attending a number of conferences, been to, Reason Cons, to a bunch of Mormon history conferences. I was at the Reason Rally in Washington, D.C. 2 years ago. And yeah, I think it's just a really awesome community with a lot of really good people. And the more support that I can give, the more support and the more that it can hopefully grow.
Awesome. Now, here's what you need to pay attention to, callers and listeners. Bryce is an ex-Mormon. At least he uses that term kind of loosely, right? Was a part of the Mormon community and now isn't, and has certain beliefs about Mormonism. So if you identify as a Mormon or an ex-Mormon, Bryce has graciously given himself today so that you can talk to him yourself and ask him questions, or he can ask you questions. And so if you're a general atheist or Christian or any other beliefs that you want to talk about, UFOs, Bigfoot, whatever, you're more than welcome to come on. But if you're a Mormon, this is like the perfect opportunity. We've been kind of plugging Bryce coming on this week. Been really excited to have him on. He is a super cool person. So just FYI, if you identify in any of those communities, definitely come on, because this is the show for you, and that's what we're going to do today. So yeah, you have an interesting relationship with Mormonism in general. I know that you kind of, grew up Mormon, and yeah. I don't know how much you want to get into the history of that and your personal life, but if maybe you could just talk about that just a little bit about how you got to where you were then to where you are now.
Yeah, I'll do my best to try and nutshell this, but yeah, I was what us Mormons call born in the covenant. I was born in Utah Mormonism, the Mecca of Mormonism, as it's often called. And that's, I grew up just north of Salt Lake City in the heart of where, Mormonism really gained a foothold thanks to Brigham Young. And I didn't cross most of the lines that most are, like check off most of the check boxes that a lot of Mormons do, because I left while I was still a teenager, about 16, 17 years old. And in order to go through the temple and be sealed and go on your mission and everything, all of that happens after that time. But I didn't leave out of any convictions that this isn't true, or that, I didn't have any theological or intellectual differences with the church. It was, honestly, I left the church out of apathy. I just didn't like going anymore. But I had a number of conversations with my parents about it, and they were very open-minded about it, that, if you don't want to go to church, we're not going to force you, because you should want to go to church. You should go because you want to go. And I thought that was very good of them to do. And since then, I moved out of Utah. And once I moved out of Utah, that's when I started coming into contact with a number of people who had never been Mormon. And it's really weird, the cultural dynamic in Utah, because everybody there is or knows Mormons. And once you leave Utah, when you're born and raised there, you kind of grow up with this understanding that the entire world is Mormon. But once you leave Utah and you realize that Mormonism isn't really a thing, or it's not paid attention to, or it's just yet another church everywhere except for Utah, it definitely adds some perspective. So I ended up getting in a number of conversations with a Christian friend of mine at the time. And of course, a lot of Christian denominations will educate their parishioners on how satanic and blasphemous the Mormons are. And he introduced me to some of what I would call at the time anti-Mormon literature that caused me to, really question, like, I didn't know any of this. I don't know this about the church. I didn't know this about the history. So he provided a few resources like, hey, check this out. Go check this out. Read this book, watch this documentary, and then we can have these conversations. And that is what really began me tumbling down the rabbit hole of religions, religious history, and different faith traditions. And it did kind of spawn this understanding of, like, there are many more religions out there than Mormonism. There are tens of thousands of more Christianities beyond Mormonism. Even Mormonism itself has hundreds of sects that are broken up within its own history. And it required me moving outside of Utah and interacting with people of other faith traditions to actually have that realization come to mind. And, after a number of interactions, that's when I kind of began tumbling down the rabbit hole of Mormon history specifically, and that engendered my interest in it. And from then on, I've rapidly consumed it every single day in some kind of form, and I just can't get enough of it because history is really cool.
Man, so it sounds like to me like the biggest impact was just encountering people with different perspectives, especially perspectives of people who had just never even grew up Mormon, and how they understood the Mormon church and what the history was like to them from their point of view and stuff. And just the conversations in the literature just kind of opened your mind a bit more to the beliefs that you already had. I mean, is that like a fair summary of kind of what happened in the very shortest of terms?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The thing is when you're in Mormonism, they have a total iron fist on the information that you are able to consume. And it isn't that they control the information. It's more that they tell you what information is approved of and disapproved of. And there are a ton of cultural and societal ramifications that come along with what literature you consume, with what information you allow into your mind. And when members of the church are able to brand something as quote unquote anti-Mormon, that has really powerful mind controlling mechanism in order to stifle thought. And once I started consuming this quote unquote anti-Mormon literature, that's when I realized how much I didn't know about even my own religion. And it was interesting because at that time I didn't really have much of a belief in it anymore, but I came to understand that I don't believe in it, and I find it very interesting. I find the history of it, the theology of it very interesting, but I don't believe that it's my pathway to salvation. However, if I did believe that understanding Mormonism and understanding all of the finer points of doctrine and theology and history was my way to salvation, why wouldn't I be interested in this
Mm.
subject? Which it
Yes.
was that was kind of a hard threshold to get over of, why aren't all of my friends, childhood friends and family members, why are they not interested in it? They believe that this is how they get to heaven. Yet I don't believe that, and I know more about the church than they do, and they don't ever want to talk about it. It's always been it's always been a bit of a barrier in bridging those old relationships, and it's unfortunate. It's not easy, and I know that a lot of ex-Mormons and secular Mormons go through very similar things when they decide to leave the church as well.
Yeah, so that's so interesting because one of the things I wanted to do when I first started this show, in case this is your first time watching The Truth Wanted and you're wondering what this is all about, is this is a call-in show so we can talk about those other perspectives and we can talk about those beliefs. And those things, I do agree, if they're true, they're super important. And I want to hear about them. And that's why I want to open the phone lines to anybody who wants to talk about these things and who can, maybe come convince us because currently Bryce and I would say, aren't religious and don't hold the religious beliefs that we once did, at least. And that's okay because like people are dynamic and people are changing. But like maybe you can call and help us with that change. Maybe you can kind of challenge us, or maybe we can challenge you in some ways with some of our experiences. So again, this is just a call to action for those of you who are maybe thinking about calling the show but aren't sure yet. Please do. The number is there on screen at the bottom corner. That is 512-686-0879. We have 5 open lines right now. And I really want to hear your other perspectives. If you have questions for Bryce and how he got to the way he is, I think Bryce is super willing to talk about it. And I think before we go to the calls, I just want to ask again, Bryce, if somebody could present to you evidence to your satisfaction that Mormonism, at least in some form, is true, do you think that you would be even open to that concept?
Absolutely. But and of course I put a big but on the answer, right?
Mm-hmm.
We have to define what is true. What does true mean? And what do you define as Mormonism?
Mm-hmm.
Because there are other sects of Mormonism that did not follow Brigham Young, that did not follow Joseph Smith III, that did not follow all of the other prophets that had claims to the prophetic mantle, that all fall under the umbrella of Mormonism somehow. So what Mormonism are we talking about? What does it mean to be true? And what evidence are you using to conclude that truth, whatever that test of truth is being met? Let's talk about that. I'm open to the evidence wherever the evidence may lead me.
Oh, that's so great. Okay, so it wasn't intended to be a trick question, but it's a question I've been asked similarly about my Christian background. And I know I'm talking about me, it's supposed to be about Bryce today, but I give the exact same answer for those of you who don't know. Like I used to be part of a Christian sect as well. I give the exact same thing. I have to know what it means when we're talking about true, and I have to know what it means when we're talking about Christianity, because like you're saying, when it comes to any of these religious beliefs, there's always going to be all kinds of interpretations, all kinds of different meanings of what true is. And you can't just say, oh, this is true without like defining some terms and without kind of explaining exactly what you mean by that. So I'm glad to see that you're open though, and I'm glad to see that you're willing to talk to people. So like I said, folks, go ahead and try to call in if you want to talk. Are you ready to take some calls now?
More than happy to. Absolutely.
Okay, cool. So first, we're going to start off with a continuous caller who's called in the past couple of shows. So we'll have to catch you up with this conversation we've been happening. This is Delon. He's from California, and we've been talking about consciousness and how it's fundamental to like pretty much everything, right? I mean, Delon, is that, I don't know, that's probably not the best way to put it. Maybe you want to put it in your own words.
Sure. First of all, hello, Dan, and hello, Bryce. How are you guys doing today?
Oh, man, fantastic.
Thanks for calling in.
Awesome. Yeah, we had been talking about consciousness being irreducible, and that's kind of fundamental. It's kind of like gravity, electromagnetism, something irreducible considered fundamental. And I'd been kicking around the idea different ways of kind of seeing that.
already with the questions. Yeah, so this is the third time we've actually had this conversation, and it's been a really continuing conversation. Like we've kind of talked about different things. But maybe if you could, can you give like a basic thesis to Bryce, since he hasn't been on before, and maybe for others who haven't caught up?
Sure. So like I've kind of, and I think we were kind of talking about it, maybe not in these exact terms, we were kind of scattered on the conversation, but basically I have 4 axioms to what I guess materialism or really anybody would need to account for to kind of make sense of consciousness. First of all, I would say that the 4 axioms would be structure, information, integration, and exclusion. And it's kind of what I was getting at with the earlier calls is that, first of all, when I mean structured, every experience is different. There's aspects of experience like colors, shapes, etc. And these are the structures of an experience. The second one is information. And what I mean by that is that it's an intrinsic meaning that can differentiate between two experiences. For example, it's kind of like frames of a movie. One frame is different to the other. And I think some neuroscientists would tell you that, the moment of an experience lasts for about 1/10 of a second. And there's a lot of different experiences you can have just within 1 second, but that's what I mean by information.
Okay.
And then integration would mean that these experiences are always one thing. It's a non-dual experience. In other words, there's a foreground when you're like for sight, there's a foreground, a background, there's sounds, there's colors.
Okay.
It's all in one experience, like a unity, right?
Okay.
And then the fourth thing would be like an exclusion principle, meaning an experience is only one thing. You're not going to experience things in faster or slower time scales, for example, right?
Okay.
Or you're not going to see, only the left side of something or only the right. It's all unified and binded into a single experience, and it's excluded from anything else. So that's what I mean. And these axioms, if true, mean that whatever's out there must account for these properties: structure, information, integration, and exclusion. And it's kind of hard to talk about because, as me and Dan were going on, it's always it's kind of a philosophical sort of question,
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of weird. So I was thinking today, because I'd been reading and kind of looking at it and trying to figure out how can we talk about it in a different way. And one of the ways that I was thinking was kind of looking at it as the illusion of self. Is very related to that, right? Like, there's a spiritual teaching in Buddhism called anatta. Is anyone familiar with that?
Ooh, maybe. I'm wondering if we could kind of reroute the conversation just a little bit. And it's not that this isn't interesting, but I think the claim that was central that we were kind of focusing on, and I want to bring Bryce into this conversation because he was already asking questions. I think your central claim that you brought in was consciousness was a fundamental property of the universe.
Yep.
Yeah, and I want to like let Bryce maybe tackle that a little bit because it sounds like he's ready to go.
Sure.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah,
Great.
So just a few questions here. So the way that it sounds like you described it with your 4 proposed axioms, I don't know if those are philosophically agreed upon axioms, but it sounds like you're proposing them as possibles. When it comes to consciousness, it seems like the proposition that you're providing is completely binary. Either something is conscious or something is not conscious. And that because consciousness exists, therefore it is axiomatic that it is a constant in the universe. So I don't necessarily have an issue with that, but I do take an issue with considering consciousness as binary of something is or is not conscious, because consciousness has so many things built into it. So I guess I would ask then, if you were provided examples of things that are on a consciousness spectrum, not completely conscious, not completely unconscious, but there's an entire spectrum of consciousness, would that change your understanding or your beliefs in this universal constant that you claim has these 4 axiomatic principles?
So I guess what you're asking is, or maybe can you restate that a little bit? I think I know what you mean, but I want to make sure I answer it correctly here.
Yeah. So let me just provide an example. So
Sure.
What it sounds like is this is an anthropocentric view of what consciousness is. We are humans. We view consciousness. Humans are conscious. But if I showed you a different life form that has a different degree of consciousness, then would that change your understanding or your beliefs about consciousness?
Oh, okay. I see what you mean. So I actually agree with that 100%. In fact, I believe that consciousness is non-reducible, and it's actually can be looked at as something fundamental. Meaning, there's this idea of emergence, or even better, epiphenomenal emergence, which is that if only you combine enough of the right that matter together in just the right way, that voila, you get genie out of the bottle, right? And that's more of a materialistic sort of explanation. But what I'm kind of kicking around is the idea that consciousness actually goes all the way down. In other words, maybe not in the way that humans are conscious, but perhaps there's different levels of consciousness that can be quantified one day. That, this is kind of a typical idea in AI research. And I kind of feel that would be a good way to explain emergence a lot better than, trying to utilize or appeal to a combination problem, because that's kind of a fallacy. To think that if you just combine enough matter in just the right way, that something like consciousness would arise that way.
So let me dive into that a little bit further, if you don't mind. So as far as let's try and focus on the concept of consciousness being irreducible. And if something is irreducible, then it seems like even if it exists on a continuum, then you degrade, you reduce it to the point that it gets to the end of that continuum. And then that is the point of irreducibility at the very bottom of that continuum, right? So if we have, let's say, humans are X level of consciousness, and then, other sapient and sentient creatures like, dolphins or raccoons or other monkeys are somewhere around that similar level of consciousness where they can recognize themselves in a mirror, they can understand their own body parts, and they have a sense of proprioception. And we look at the degree, maybe a few degrees down. Like a cat isn't as sentient or sapient as a human being, right? And if we're using those as our criteria for claiming something as conscious, then a cat is less conscious than a human being is. Right. So we can continue to walk down this continuum in degrees to the point that we are reducing the criteria of what is considered consciousness to the point that we get to single-celled organisms that have no sense of proprioception, they have no intelligence, they have no anything that we would consider a conscious being would have. But at what point do you reduce something to the point that you can?
Right. That's the hard problem of consciousness. Where you draw the line. One of the examples in nature that you look at, you were talking about one-celled sort of creatures or something like that. If you look at slime mold is really interesting. It acts intelligently. It solves problems. It remembers things. It even acts irrationally. It has a lot of cognitive functions. Now, the problem with that is it's kind of hard to say whether it's conscious, depending on what we mean by conscious. But on the other hand, I really can't say 100% that you are conscious or my dog is conscious, right? Because it's a subjective thing. What we can do, though, is we can make these correlations with behavior. If a thing is acting intelligently, if it's aware of its environment, internally, externally, it's reasonable to conclude that it has at least some measure of this thing we're calling consciousness. So, following that logic, just trying to be consistent, when I look at something like a slime mold or amoeba, these, cells, these bacteria, viruses, they all sort of act in the same manner. Where do we draw the line? I don't know. I don't know if you can. Perhaps, I was kind of mentioning before, perhaps beyond the behavior, it would be maybe a principle that just like everything else in the universe, all matter and energy has a principle or some sort of probability distribution of making these things true. I think you get down into quantum mechanics and you get down into all these type of things. These probabilities kind of give rise to the reality that we see, that we experience, and that we observe. Perhaps that same principle is somewhere embedded way down into the fine structures of space-time. I don't know. I know that there are people like Roger Penrose. He's like, I don't know if you're familiar with him. He's like a super mathematician and physicist, Nobel Prize winner. He actually kind of feels that consciousness may be something like that it may be part of that whole thing. And it kind of explains the observer effect, maybe not in the way that the Copenhagen interpretation may, interpret that. But there's all sorts of ideas out there that people, that really smarter guys than me that are kicking around, they're really interested. And so I just kind of see that it kind of makes sense to me, because at least you kind of get out of that categorical error of just thinking magically that, consciousness experience is real. Does it just come about magically by combining enough dumb things together? I mean, that just kind of doesn't do it for me. I'm not saying that it's not, that's not the case.
Yeah, that's kind of,
I don't know.
that's really, really interesting that you word it that way, because I think we kind of talked about this last week as well, because I think we do know that there are some things that do happen as emergent properties, right? Like we talked about oxygen and hydrogen atoms on their own, not necessarily being wet, but like together in a certain structure, they have the property of like wetness. And I can't quite remember what your response was to that, but it seems strange to me that you would rule that out as a possibility of conscious. And you also mentioned earlier that consciousness is subjective, as if we don't have some sort of like metric to understand what consciousness is. And I think that is also, I mean, like you gave a list of examples of what it could be, but it almost seems strange to me to say that if consciousness is subjective to some degree, if we don't have some sort of criteria, then I don't know how we could say that there is a fundamental aspect to it, because saying that there's a fundamental aspect to it kind of doesn't make it subjective anymore. It kind of makes it something that we can recognize as objective, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and again, that's the hard problem. That's part of it. It's a difference between maybe a panpsychic view of fundamental consciousness and an idealistic sort of way of viewing it. But I guess to clarify, like to say, there's two ways to look at it. Like, for example, when my tooth hurts, I have a feeling of pain, right? Now that's different from the neural mechanisms that might give rise to the pain, right?
Why is that?
Those are two different things.
What makes that different?
They relate to each other. But what bridges them together is this idea of information, which is fundamental to everything that really we call existing. So this information transfer is the difference between, the C fibers firing and the actual experience. The experience is what I mean by the subjective part.
Okay, so like the qualia almost.
Yeah, the qualia. There you go.
Okay.
The qualia.
All right, I think Bryce had some questions he wanted to ask as well.
Yeah, so
Sure.
I want to be very careful about the definitions we're using here, and I hope that I can get you to define your definitions a little bit here, because it seems a few minutes ago when you were talking about the consciousness basically being the underpinnings of the universe, I wonder if you can help us define your concept of consciousness a little bit better, because it seems like the way that it's been thrown around in this conversation, that it has been used,
I know.
it's a term that's been applied to a lot of different things. So I'm kind of having a hard time using such an unwieldy word for the purpose of the conversation.
It's so slippery.
Yeah. Can you just define consciousness kind of in your own terms, without,
Sure.
walking us through your four logic arguments of why you think it's, it is an axiom.
Consciousness for me is experience, like what it's like to be something. That experience in and of itself. That's what I mean by consciousness. If I talk about, when we get into talking about thinking and intelligence, these are sort of like modes of consciousness. And these are what I guess philosophers call the easy problem. Not that they're really easy. I mean, that's kind of a slap in the face to a lot of people that work hard on these things. But those are the easy problems. We can kind of make those correlations, and they're really helpful. But what's the hard problem? What's considered the hard problem is the experience. Like, why should there be an experience when C fibers fire up, right? All this stuff could necessarily go on in the dark, like a computer.
Let's explore that. Let's explore that because I think that's an interesting question of experience, because I think experience in and of itself is a completely different word than consciousness. But the way that it's like you're using it is that experience is one aspect of consciousness.
Perfect.
If there were something that it could be shown that it is experiencing something, but doesn't have the sentience to realize that it's experiencing that thing, is that still consciousness? And I can provide an example if you'd like.
Right. So experience seems like, when I really think about it, it seems to be a neutral thing. It seems to kind of be the screen on which the movie plays, right? And it's, like a philosophical zombie, right? Could be reacting to its environment, maybe like an AI machine, a computer. We don't know if they have any kind of subjective experience of what it's like. I just think that if there's behavior, the best I can do to be consistent, at least, is suppose that there is some sort of experience in relation to the properties, to the physical properties that we can measure. We can measure those because it happens within myself, right? So maybe that's a better way to kind of describe it. I don't know if that's exactly what you're pointing at.
Yeah, so I just kind of want to a little bit more drill down on exactly then how we define consciousness, because by your previous definition, you said it's the experience that something has. But if I can propose the example of if I have the experience of rolling down a hill, I'm going to recognize that this is unpleasant. I'm going to get dirty. I'm going to bump my arms and legs, bump my head on stuff. I'm going to recognize that that is an unpleasant experience. But a rock rolling down the hill, in and of itself, the rock doesn't recognize what it's experiencing. But an outside observer can understand that the rock, if it were a sentient or a sapient conscious being, that it's going through an experience of some sort. Yes. So by that term alone, I think experience is a very hard word to conflate, even because it introduces so much subjectivity. And when we're trying to define consciousness in and of itself, there's so many things that are wrapped up into it that I'm just having a hard time understanding exactly what definition you're trying to use. What would be a synonym that you would use for the way that you're using the term consciousness right now?
Yeah, and let me comment on this just a little bit, because I think we also need to clarify when we're talking about consciousness, and if we make sweeping claims like everything is consciousness, well, suddenly, if everything is consciousness, then we have no way of determining what is conscious and what's non-conscious. And if we believe that something is like non-conscious, then how we suddenly don't have a method to determine what is and isn't. It kind of reminds me of this way.
That's huge right there. Yeah. That's a huge misunderstanding, and I probably should make that really clear too. So by saying that I view consciousness as fundamental or irreducible, I am not really saying that everything is conscious. That's just not true. That's not. Even panpsychists don't say that, or even idealists don't necessarily say that either.
You're kind of saying that everything has the fundamental properties by which something could potentially be conscious.
The potential is all. There's a principle embedded in reality that if things were if there's a system that has a causal effect on itself as well as the outside world, and mainly it's itself, then that thing could be said to be conscious.
Okay, so this is
integrating information is where I get that.
Okay, I see that. There's an observation that I see. Everything I've ever observed to be conscious or have the properties of conscious has been biological and has been structured in a certain way, has had particular kinds of atoms, and has always been arranged in a particular way. I've never seen consciousness outside of these particular structures. And so to me, that almost says, well, if consciousness isn't separate from these structures, then what reason do I have to believe that consciousness exists outside of these structures as far as an emergent property? Now, I know that's not a perfect argument, right? And I'm not necessarily trying to make an argument, but this is just based on observation. If we're talking about things that have the capacity to be conscious, then I would say that there might be certain things which have never demonstrated themselves to have the capacity to be conscious. So I wouldn't understand how I could make the claim that everything could be conscious. Does that make sense?
Right. So let's take another example of something fundamental. Let's look at gravity. You're not going to see gravity's effects everywhere. You're only going to see it in relative examples. Gravity is, when you have mass plus the distance of another object, then you can kind of measure the effect of the gravity that exists, right?
Yeah.
But it's considered a fundamental thing in nature. It's just a feature of reality, right?
Okay.
So in that sense, it's not that, and you can even tweak gravity. You can even change it. You can even mess with it. You can do all kinds of things. The same thing with consciousness. You can tweak your consciousness. If I drink too many beers, my consciousness is definitely going to change, right?
So we do change gravity, but by changing gravity, we have to change like the mass of something, right? Like we are changing the structures that are like interacting with each other almost.
Exactly. There's one thing that never changes, and that's the principle of gravity itself. We don't just get rid of gravity. We don't. That doesn't happen. And I think with consciousness, it's kind of the same thing. It's like electromagnetism. Wherever it's conducive, you're going to see the effects. But that principle exists as a feature of our reality. And I think that consciousness is a feature of our reality. It's possible for things to be conscious if combined the right way, if the systems are sophisticated enough, or if they have some sort of causal effect, they can emerge just like anything. And really, I've always wondered, after I've kind of thought about it, it shouldn't really be that controversial of an idea.
Baby, I want to let Bryce talk about this a little bit more, but
sure.
I also know that there are particles in nature that aren't affected by gravity. So to say that it's fundamental that gravity is a fundamental part of like everything, it would almost be wrong. Like a photon, for example, isn't as well. Actually, I think photons are affected by gravity. I'm not entirely sure. I'm not a physicist, right? But okay, so as an example, if I could demonstrate something, is there a way, a method that we could use to demonstrate that something is or is not fundamental to consciousness? Because I think that's the only way we can really ever know if this hypothesis you're saying is true.
Exactly. Oddly enough, I read an article just today. It's kind of weird that this comes up, but it's a new article, and you might want to check it out. Maybe the listeners can check it out, but it's basically what happened is there's this AI computer, and what's happened is subjects will lay in an fMRI machine, and they'll look at images, right? Now, this fMRI machine is measuring brain waves, and it's actually sending the brain waves down a wire, right? And it's being received by an AI computer on the other end. And the way that this AI machine works is by reconstructing in the exact fashion that a human brain reconstructs information when it perceives something. It says it just like that explicitly in this article. And it came about because former President Obama started this whole brain mapping project a few years ago. And so the brain has been fully mapped and fully, as far as the processes, just kind of mapped out. And they utilize those same, logical instructions in this program that the AI uses, to reconstruct images that are sent down the wire. And so it produces these images onto a screen, onto a monitor. And you can actually go on the internet and you can look at how it's looking at people's thoughts. And so one of the researchers, I forget exactly what article I read that, but he was saying that basically that kind of points to consciousness or perception being informational, right? That all you really need is a structure that can process the information sufficiently, like a brain or a computer, or it really doesn't matter what the structure is. As long as it can process that information, it can have a flash of an experience. So they're kind of thinking that this AI machine is actually having a moment of an experience because it's actually mimicking exactly what the human subject is doing when they see the image. So it kind of opens up a philosophical question. Of course, you're not inside the mind of the AI machine to know that.
Mm-hmm.
But if it were true, and they're kind of exploring it to kind of look to make sure that they can maybe quantify that somehow. And if that's true, then it kind of substantiates what I'm saying here, that it's, consciousness is also information. Information is basically everything. I mean, that's basically what the universe is made of.
Okay. A lot of stuff going on here.
And actually, one thing that we have effectively done throughout this conversation is dabble into entire fields of scientific research that have been constructed for hundreds of years and been theorized and tested. And I think it's clear that none of the three of us have any expertise in most of the fields that we've been pulling information and dabbling into here. So I actually want to take an opportunity to rewind back to 20 minutes ago and say, so Dylan,
so very quickly, before you go on, I just want to let everybody know that we still have open lines on the calls, folks, and we really want to take more calls. I'd like to try to wrap up this conversation because we've been kind of going on for a little bit now, and I'd like to get more calls to go in. But yeah, definitely, please call in the line if you can. So anyway, continue.
Feel free to cut me off when I ask this question here, Dan. But I was just going to say, Dylan, if you could plant your flag on what your belief is when you're constructing all of these I don't know how to say it, but the very cumbersome, very weighty arguments to try and understand consciousness. If you had to stake your flag on your belief of what consciousness is, how would you summarize that? How would you say that in a succinct sentence?
Yeah, I'll make it really quick. I would say that my belief is that consciousness is probably defined or described better by panpsychism. There's different versions of panpsychism, so I don't want to get into all that, but basically that principally consciousness is a feature of our universe, fundamentally. It doesn't happen everywhere. I'm not saying that when we die, our consciousness continues. I'm not saying any of that. I don't think that's true for 1 minute. But I'm just saying that, consciousness, just like gravity, just like electromagnetism, spin, charge, you name it, I think it's part of that. I'm kind of leaning towards that. I'm not 100% certain, of course. I don't want to be a deluded person. So I'm kind of leaning maybe 60% to that belief.
So I don't know anything about panpsychism. It sounds very interesting, and it sounds like a very weighty term, like it has a lot of faceted pieces that require understanding. But
Yeah.
if you own a different model that would express or that would show where consciousness comes from that does not comport with panpsychism, then would you
Mhm.
be willing to change your beliefs on where you think consciousness comes from?
Oh yeah, 100%.
Okay.
100%. I'm like you guys, truth wanted. I'm not married to a belief necessarily. Everyone has opinions, and there's good opinions, there are bad ones. I try to make good opinions and informed opinions, and that's what it's based on. But I also know that I can be wrong, of course, and I've been wrong before, so I would be glad to be wrong, actually.
There you go. What an answer. I
That
like
is a
that.
Yeah.
fantastic answer.
Yeah.
Good. Keep
Yeah.
seeking the truth, whatever it may
Yes.
lead us.
Well, Dylan, you have been a faithful caller to the show. This is your third call in. And hey, let me ask you this. Next time you call in, you think we could talk about something else besides consciousness?
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that it's not an interesting topic, but I'd love to
Yep.
see what else you believe, man, because I'm sure you have some other stuff we could talk
I've got another
about.
one. I've got a few things we can talk. Free will.
Oh my goodness.
What is the self? Oh man, it goes on.
You're an astute, you're a scholar and a saint, as they say.
Well, thank you, sir.
I really appreciate it, and I really want to talk to you again sometime. Thanks again for calling, man.
You got it, brothers. Y'all have a good one.
All right, we'll
It was
see you
good.
later.
Thank you so much.
Man, fun stuff.
Yeah, that was honestly, that was very challenging to. I mean, I felt like I was clinging on to the edge of that conversation with my like white knuckle fingertips because it was accelerating so fast into the next, into the next, into the next subject. And I enjoy those conversations, and it depends on who you're talking to, whether or not those conversations are completely futile or they're interesting. And that was really quite interesting. I enjoyed that quite a bit.
Yeah, I bet that wasn't the first call you'd expect to get today on this show. But this show, it throws some curveballs at you. Let me tell you, that's the third time that we've talked about this. And, gosh, there's just so many angles you can go at it with this.
Right.
Here's my brief summary of what I think about this entire conversation, because Dinesh D'Souza is a guy that I've heard say this as well, that like consciousness is fundamental, and like there's kind of a woo factor in there for me. And the biggest thing is like, okay, so like atoms are fundamental for like bodies, right? And for like things, I guess. And I get that because they're like matter, but like when you start talking about consciousness, it's hard to put a label like that on things because
Well, yeah. And where I think it kind of breaks down is what fundamental in and of itself is a pretty loaded term, because fundamental, it necessarily means that whatever piece you're talking about, the fundamental piece of that whole is required in order for the whole to be what it is.
Mhm.
And in that sense, yes, consciousness exists in our universe. Therefore, by that definition, it is fundamental. It is a fundamental piece of the universe. But I don't think that the universe cares that there are conscious actors within it.
Yeah.
So it's not like the universe requires consciousness to exist. It just so happens that consciousness does exist and is therefore a fundamental piece of the universe.
Yes, for sure. I feel the exact same way. It's kind of like saying telephones are fundamental to existence because things can be eventually made into telephones or something. I don't know if that's the best
Yeah.
analogy, but it's saying that something is part of the system doesn't mean that it's fundamental to the system, I think is like the most basic way I would put it.
But the best part about that whole call was that he said, we walked through all of these points, and then by the end of it, he says, well, I'm X percentage certain that this is a way to understand consciousness, but I'm totally okay with being completely wrong about that. And I'm just, just like you guys, truth is wanted. So I don't know. I think that's an extremely healthy way to just approach everything, because he
Yes.
was introducing concepts that my mind cannot even begin to grasp the
Oh, for sure.
subjects that are built into each subject.
Yeah, skepticism is a virtue, that gets tossed
It
around
is a
sometimes.
pursuit.
Yes.
Yes.
Man, that harkens me back to I'm stalling right now, folks, because we're waiting on some callers to come on in. So if you want to call in, go ahead and call. But it harkens me back to the conversations we had. I don't know because the Mormon view on souls is very different from the Christian view on souls and how that works. But it does remind me of this kind of conversation of souls being fundamental to the human person, essentially.
Right.
And you hear this come up with abortion debates and all kinds of stuff. And that always, even as a child, that really confused me as far as how the insulation process works. Does the soul exist before a human does? And what does it even mean to say that someone has a soul and someone doesn't? It's a crazy conversation.
It is. Yeah. And if you are, if we're needing to fill a little bit more airtime, like when I had you onto my live stream on the Name of Home Evening, you can find that on the Naked Mormonism YouTube channel. I tried my very best to defend Joseph Smithicism.
Yeah.
I claim that Joseph Smith is a mythical figure, and that was fun. But it's not something that I actually truly believe. It's not something that we could dig into very deeply just because we were just having fun, right?
Yes, that was so interesting, though. You defend, I'm not a Mormon, right? So I can't verify all the facts that you were giving at that time, but that was really interesting. For those of you who don't know or haven't seen it, you should definitely go check it out on Bryce Blankenagel's channel. But basically, we had this conversation where Bryce pretended that Joseph Smith was a mythical figure created by Brigham Young, who is another early member of the Mormon Church. And he gave this very, very detailed explanation on why he thinks that is. And I had this conversation with him with two other ex-Mormons. And I think the two other ex-Mormons were much more interested in the details you could come up with. And I was more interested in how the heck did you get to this conclusion? Totally. It's kind of crazy.
Well, and if I can draw a bit of a parallel to somebody like a Deepak Chopra or Dinesh D'Souza, what I was able to do was understand where the Socratic method was going to come in and understand where I didn't have an argument. And I was able to continue to pile on the facts and information and continue introducing new rabbit trails to the point that we never really got to that fundamental question of, okay, what degree of certainty do you have that Joseph Smith was a mythical person?
Yes.
And I was able to completely keep you off of examining the entire thing as a whole through a critical and skeptical mind, which I think is much the way that, like, when Deepak Chopra starts talking about the quantum fluctuations, that our consciousness is a manifestation of so on and so forth, and all of it's hard to distinguish between the Deepak Chopra word generator website that's just a satire of him as opposed to his actual talks. But it's just knowing enough large words and knowing enough little tiny factoids or snippets and interweaving them into an entire field of woo, constructing a web of woo that's strung together with little facts. It made it so that we were very hard pressed to find a point to drill down on whether or not I believe or to what degree of certainty I have that belief in. But if you're wanting to fill more airtime, we could discuss a belief that I sincerely hold. That is that it's not something that I quote unquote sincerely hold, but a belief that I personally have in Mormon history that may, it may be interesting to some of the listeners, and it's at least a fun conversation starter with missionaries. But if we have, another caller at any time, I'd be more than happy to speak with them as well.
I think so. I think we're having some calls on actually, and they're just not showing up on my screen. And I think that's what's going on. So I think I can take some of these calls right here. I don't know what they want to talk about, but I'm going to see if one of these will work.
Awesome.
My producer's mouthing something to me and I can't read his lips, but I'm just going to go for it and see where this goes. So I'm just going to hit a button here at random and we'll see if they're on. Hello, caller. You're on the air. I don't have your name. If one of the callers who's on the line could go ahead and speak and we'll figure out who it is.
Hello?
Hello. I heard a
hear me?
woman's voice. Yes.
Yes. My name is Alex,
Hello, Alex.
and I'm in Arkansas.
How's it going?
Thanks for calling.
Great. How about yourself?
We're doing good. We're just having a little bit of technical difficulties. I think we've been having some callers on and we just haven't been able to see them on screen. So now we're getting to talk to you. So what do you want to talk to us about?
Well, sweet. I've actually got a couple of things, but they sort of tie together, I think. So I guess a little bit of context. I've identified as an atheist since I was about like 13. I'm 26 currently, so roughly half my life. But I've never been like out and open about it. Like I've been out insofar as like if I get asked a direct question, I'm not really going to dodge it or anything. Like I'll give a straight answer, but I've never really volunteered information about like where I stand on atheism, among some other things. So I guess I would like to hear sort of your guys' input on how you both handled coming out, especially Bryce. I mean, I grew up in a Catholic household, but I imagine like from what I've heard of Mormons, it's really very tied into sort of your social structure, being within that religion. So I'd like to hear from you guys sort of how you handled that. And then sort of to tie into that, I wanted to maybe discuss the ethics behind maybe attempting to deconvert people that are in your social circle.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Those are great questions. Bryce is our guest today, so I definitely want him to give as full and as much of an answer that he wants to give, and then I'll kind of tie in a little bit with my story and stuff.
Sure. So I'll try and do my best and just share what I have had success with, and when I have talked to other ex-Mormons and ex-religious people, what they have had success with. When it comes to talking to family members, friends.
Oh no, Bryce, are you there? Oh, we might have lost him for a second. He'll probably come back on in a little bit. So I'll go ahead and answer in the meantime. There he is. Okay.
That was an inopportune time. My apologies. I'll start again.
Go ahead.
No worries.
So when it comes to talking to family members, friends about beliefs or lack thereof, what I think is very important is you need to get to the root of why they are asking questions or why they want to know about your belief or your lack of belief, right? And, you know, you live in Arkansas. I would assume that the majority of people out there believe that they believe the same religious propaganda that you can't be good without being religious, right? Somebody's a good Christian out there or they're a godless heathen, right?
Right.
So when somebody makes an assertion like that, or when they ask, how can you be good without God? You have to recognize the very kernel of their motivation of why they may be asking something like that. And that's not always easy because questions can come in so many different forms and people have myriad motivations for asking questions. But when somebody says, how can you be good without God? It can come from a place of they genuinely want to know. It can come from a place of they're worried that if the world descends into atheism, it will therefore descend into anarchy and, people killing and stealing and there's no rule whatsoever. People can believe that our morality is inextricably tied from our belief in God. And when you lose your belief in God, you lose your morality. And oftentimes the motivations for that is all rooted in fear. They fear lack of understanding. They fear not knowing where we get our morality from, because then that means it may not be an easy answer that they've been told their entire lives is correct. So trying to boil down their question to why they're asking it and answering the question of why they are asking it instead of directly answering the question, I found that to be a lot more successful, and it bridges that gap a lot easier, I think.
Yeah, beautiful
Yeah,
answer.
getting to the root of like what their actual concern is.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right.
Here's my advice. If you want to get involved with what I'm doing right now, which is helping out with the atheist community of Austin, or even getting in the activism stuff, first of all, I say have as much conversations as you feel comfortable with having with the people around you first before you do that. And there's a very particular reason why I say this, although there are several. But the biggest one I think of is I noticed a lot of people who didn't know the transition that I was having kind of thought, whoa, this guy had a sudden change and this was like really crazy. And now he's this super radical atheist guy who's doing all this stuff. And I think that reinforces this stereotype that a lot of people have about the atheist community.
Right.
When
Like
really,
it's just a phase or something.
when I know as much as you do, this was probably for you a long time coming. Right. And this was something you've probably put a lot of thought into and have spent a lot of time questioning and doing research in good faith, to use that term in its proper context, of trying to figure out what the truth is. Right. You were seeking the truth. And this is the conclusion that you've come to. And also that you're still open to hearing other points of view, which is super critical. So I want to echo what Bryce is saying in saying that I think that those conversations are great, and that specifically the way that he was talking about having them, but just see gently what you can have at first and see if these things resonate with other people. You might find that people might agree with you in some ways. I talk to Christians who agree with me on a lot of these same kinds of issues, but I say, come out gracefully if you can. Show that, hey, you're another productive member of society and you just think about things differently. Because if you come out the wrong way and you make these big statements without talking with people who you're already with in community and stuff, that can affect people in ways that you might not expect, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I think I'm following you. Like, the tact you use with which to sort of like
Yes.
bring this up or however is going to largely affect how they're going to take it or how defensive they're going to be.
For sure. And by the way, it shouldn't be your responsibility. It really shouldn't. But unfortunately, we do live in a world that doesn't necessarily like who we are or the conclusions that we've come to. And the biggest step in making that world better is having people like us out there in the open, having these conversations and just saying, hey, we're here,
Yeah, most definitely. Would you guys be able to speak to a little bit? I know you were both involved in sort of atheist activism as far as like with strangers or people in the community, but would you be able to speak a little bit to sort of the process of coming out as far as where it concerns your family?
Yes, for sure. I'll go ahead and speak first, and then I'll let Bryce talk about it, because it's still an issue that affects me to this day, as far as the stuff that I do here at the ACA, okay? And that's not fun. Having those conversations. And the reason why I was telling you those advice earlier is because I made that mistake of kind of bottling it up inside and just kind of letting it all out. And it came this huge shock, almost a scandal to people. And I think, the best way is to make sure that your interests are protected first, that you're in a safe place, that you feel comfortable talking about it. Of course, you'll never feel completely comfortable talking about it, right? But at least you're in a place where it's not going to threaten your safety. And then the next thing I would say is, and whether or not you want to actually tell people is also a decision that you have to make. I have a really good relationship with my parents, and so I wanted them to know where I was at. Maybe that's not the best case for you and where you're at. I don't know. You sound closer to my age, and so maybe like right now, if your parents are like financially supporting you and stuff, and that becomes more of a risk, maybe it's not the best time. There's a saying that goes around that says, tell it to your parents over a dinner that you bought, so that you're out of the house and you already have your own resources and stuff. But Otherwise, it's very, very contextual. I don't know what your situation is like, so I can't speak to every single person, but I would say just don't change anything about yourself when you're talking to people. Just try to be as calm and collected as you can be. And if maybe they start getting mad, maybe they start, getting frustrated, that's for them to deal with. That's
Right.
that's not your problem. And don't change your beliefs or change the way you do things just to make them happy. You compromise if you want because they're family, right? But like, don't do it just because you need to appease them and that's the end of the story, right? Because you're an autonomous human being too, and that has to account for that. And if they want to respect you as an adult, for sure, then you need to be able to lay the groundwork and say, hey, this is where I'm at right now. And being honest about that is better than, not having that conversation at all, in my opinion. But some people disagree. I don't know. What do you think, Bryce?
So I'll try to reflect that by just saying, you got to know your audience, know your time, know your place, know where everything is, know who you're talking to, friends, family members, coworkers, know if your job or in, extreme scenarios, if your life will be threatened, if you have a conversation like this, it's like you said, Dan, it shouldn't be your responsibility, but largely because people are not going to go seek this information and probably have not had these conversations very frequently with people who are non-believers. The onus does kind of fall on you to be an emissary, an atheist emissary, for lack of better terms.
Right.
And in order to have those conversations, I think a great way to bridge the gap or to knock down the barriers that can so often happen, and this is especially effective with family members, is and it ties into what I was saying earlier, is get the believer talking about themselves and their own beliefs.
Mm-hmm.
And this entire show is constructed around the Socratic method and asking people pointed questions in order to get them to explain why they believe in what they believe. And if people can think about their belief in a meta sense, then I think they have an easier time analyzing what exactly comprises that belief. So if you can get a person talking about where their morality comes from and they say, my morality comes from my God, and then you are able to lead them into further questioning, that barrier is going to slowly be chipped away, and they may be more willing to listen to what you're going to say. And the further you step away from a screaming match, the more effective of communication you're going to have. And that's not always easy with friends and family members. I think we can all understand that. It's not always an easy conversation, but to get people opening up to you, it's, seek first to understand, then to be understood. If you get people open up to you and talk openly, then that line of communication is made in a way that information can more freely flow. And there's just a number of ways to do that. And I think, channels like this and channels like Anthony Magnabosco's channel and other epistemology channels, I think they can provide the tools that really help with that communication.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. What do you think, Alex?
I totally agree, and that's honestly really good advice. I called your show over any of the other ones because watching Anthony's channel is actually what got me more into really looking at where I stand and kind of what I think about the world, and my stance on my own sort of atheism and the way I respond to it and the way I present it to other people has been very, very passive. I think I said at the beginning of the call, I'm 26 now, and I've identified as an atheist since I was a teenager. So it's been almost half my life, but I haven't ever really been the stereotypical angry atheist or militant about it or anything like that. My family's pretty well aware that I don't attend church, but I've never used the A word around them. So it's, I feel like it's a long time coming, maybe to start gently broaching the subject. And again, in a way, I feel like I'm kind of walking a fine line between being considerate of of their beliefs and being tactful and being passive, like just not
Here's
right.
Here's an interesting question I think you should ask yourself. Are they being considerate of your beliefs? You know,
No.
Right. So are they showing you the same respect? And that's interesting because we don't really think of like atheism as kind of a belief. Sometimes, you know, like there's a discussion about that, but you have a worldview, right? You do have certain beliefs about things. What you want to call that is something else, but it's there and it exists. And I think it has just as much of a right to be respected as your parents believe, if you ask me. And maybe if you frame the conversation that way, you know, maybe you say, hey, this is the conclusions I've come to based on my experience, and I need you to respect that, you know. Maybe that's an avenue for you to talk about it. I don't know.
Yeah, most definitely.
Yeah. Well, I'm so glad you got to call into the show. I really enjoy conversations like this, especially because it hits really close to home. I remember when I was first kind of coming out, I knew this Unitarian Universalist pastor, and I was like, hey, maybe you should come with me and have lunch with my parents sometimes. You can help me explain these conversations. And that ended up not happening. But I feel the same role now. I feel like, oh man, if you want me to come talk to your parents, I'll totally do it. Like 100%. I love this kind of stuff now because I'm now more comfortable in my own skin talking about it. And plus it's not my family, right? But that hits so hard. I know that feeling of you want to do what's best and you don't want to hurt them. You know, you don't, in my case, it was making sure my parents didn't know that they raised a failure or that they failed to raise me, you know, because I think that's a thing that's really common amongst parents, that they feel like that their kid's going on the wrong path and that, oh, if we could have done things differently, it wouldn't have happened. But you and I both know that that's not the case, that if anything, where you're at now might just be inevitable, especially in the times that we're living in now. So, you know.
Yeah, and I feel like sort of like the internal conflict at this point is I cannot say anything and things are going to remain peaceful, but it's never going to go past like a really superficial kind of relationship if we can't broach big subjects like that.
Yeah, absolutely.
And let me just also add that people inherently appreciate genuineness. Being genuine, being honest, and being confident has a magnetic effect. It doesn't matter who you are, how you look, what your age is. None of that matters if you are genuine, if you are honest, and if you are confident. And I think that those features alone, if you approach the subject not like, oh, well, I don't really want to talk about that. Like, I mean, I have had, I've been that way with a lot of my family members. If you just approach it, fully, take it head on and just say that this is what I believe, and let's talk about why I believe that. I think that can also go a long way to really show beyond just what you're saying that you're trying to approach this in a good faith way and to keep intact the relationship that you have with your family members.
Yeah. And if it helps you, like 90% of the people that make content like Truth Wanted and what Bryce does have conflict with their families about their beliefs. I mean, I don't have a study on that, but the people I talk to, a lot of people who do this stuff, and it's the same. It's a very similar story. So if you can take confidence in that, then do it. But yeah, I hope this was really good advice because I know what you're going through. If anything, I'd suggest coming into the Atheist Community of Austin Discord, if you're on Discord, or come into my Facebook page on Truth Wanted. Maybe some other people can give you some advice and stuff. I mean, everybody would love to help you out. I'd love to talk to you more as well. I have an email address, and that's truth@atheist-community.org. And if you want to talk to me about that more, I'm all for it. Go for it. Anybody else watching this show who wants to talk to me more? This is the stuff I really care about, and I'm really glad you got to talk about this with us today.
Well, I appreciate it, Dan. Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. Well, we'll let you go, and hopefully we'll get a call from you again sometime.
Yeah, thanks. And nice meeting you, Bryce, as well. I appreciate it.
Likewise. Thank you, Alex. I appreciated the call.
Awesome. That was a great Wholesome call. I love it. Gosh, it's so common, and it's I wish I had the words for everybody, right? I wish I could just give everybody a hug and say it's going to get better,
Right.
because the conflict it almost never ends. There's always people in your life that aren't going to accept you at this point. Maybe that you felt the same way.
If you just look at the demographics of belief, these conversations can't help but affect the majority of people, right? If you look at non-belief of millennials as opposed to belief in older generations, just the statistical divide of millennials who no longer believe in the religion of their parents means that millions of people are having these conversations all the time, and that they're important. And we all have to, I think it's important that we share information and we share intel on how to best effectively communicate those concepts.
Yes, for sure. Yeah. There's a lot of great resources about that. The Freedom from Religion Foundation has some excellent helplines, as well as a bunch of other organizations you can check out. And like I said, check out some of the ACA resources as well if this is something you're struggling with. And contact me. I'm always available for stuff like that. But let's go ahead and go on to our next caller. This is from Austin in Tennessee, who wanted to talk to us about time and the universe.
All right.
Yes, hello, Dan.
Hello, Austin. How's it going?
It's going good.
Cool.
I wanted to try this out on here, even though it was more of a specific response to something I heard on AXP, where I think Matt Dillahunty was saying that he doesn't see how something can exist outside of time. Would that be something you all agree with?
Oh, man, this is more philosophy stuff. I don't know what it means to exist outside of time, to be honest. I've never encountered anything outside of time, so I'm not sure.
Well, the question I would ask that's sort of attached to it is it possible that time is an illusion caused by the small scales at which we observe the universe?
Maybe. Is that a belief you hold?
Yeah, that would be the belief I'm arguing for.
Okay.
The conjecture that I'm arguing for.
Okay. Can I ask you what your number one reason for believing that is? And we'll kind of go from there.
The number one reason for believing that is probably from what we know mathematically about time. We know from Minkowski and Einstein that, time is actually better understood as space-time.
Mm-hmm.
And sorry, what?
Oh, I'm nodding in agreement. I'm saying, yeah, go on.
Okay. So it shares a lot of referential properties with spatial dimensions. But, at larger scales, it kind of differs. So, for instance, a person's nearness to an object in space doesn't change depending on the frame of reference.
Okay.
So, like, if I'm 5 inches from something, I'll be 5 inches from something here. No matter whether you're observing me from, like, the surface of a star or a black hole or, wherever you're observing me from, I would still be the same distance spatially from the star. But
Yes.
if you went to tell me to touch the object after 5 seconds, then my count of 5 is going to be different from your count if you were observing me from a more massive object because of the way time works.
Okay. So time is an illusion, essentially. It doesn't exist the way most people think it does. That's kind of what you're
that's
saying.
more of an illustration of time's relativity.
Okay.
So it's relative to massive objects. Where I get to the illusion part, there's sort of a thought experiment that Einstein was, I think it was Einstein and Rosen used of the ant on the string.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm familiar with it, but okay. So
yeah,
let's. I want to kind of just examine what you've already put out there so far.
Yeah.
Bryce, do you have any comments to make first about this?
As far as time being an illusion and something that is illusory is purely subjective. So I would just ask Austin, do you think that time exists outside of the human experience? I mean, if this were a universe without humans in it, that time would still exist?
I think that what we experience as time in the universe would exist within the spatial dimensions that we occupy.
Okay.
So,
But definitionally,
whereas we're like three-dimensional, or some people would say like 3.5 dimensions, because we can only move forward in time. So if you're observing the universe from that frame of reference, then what we experience as time is always going to exist, whether we're here or not.
yeah. So I guess in that same vein, then, if your assertion is that time is experienced as an illusion, or that time is an illusion, I don't know if we can then go on to conclude that time in and of itself, if we experience it as an illusion, that's just how we see it in our minds.
Mm-hmm.
Does it immediately follow that time in and of itself is therefore an illusion?
It doesn't immediately follow from that, no. But I was getting to a thought experiment with the ant and the string. So the way I think about it is, if an ant were moving along a string, that's a pretty good approximation of one dimension. He can move forward and back and nowhere else. And if he were to do that in no space, then there wouldn't be a frame of reference for him. So he wouldn't really have any sort of count of time. We count time by referencing the universe around us, right?
Yeah, as far as I know, yeah.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So if you were to move the string, like not touching, but across a two-dimensional surface with variation, then that would create the illusion of time.
Across a two-dimensional surface.
Yeah, so like say you had like a picture or a background with variation, or maybe just a gradient. If the ant were to move across the string with that as a background, then he would have a frame of reference to count time, right?
Yes. Okay, I see what you're saying. Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of what I want to scale up, and my conjecture concludes that it may in fact be true that time is an illusion created by our perception from three dimensions, whereas there might be four dimensions, fourth dimension, or even higher dimensions, sort of like the Calabi-Yau conjecture suggests.
Okay. Cool. Yeah, that's interesting. I'm not a physicist, so it's kind of hard to talk about questions like these. From what I mean, and even then I'm biased because I've read stuff like Lawrence Krauss and stuff, which is like just not enough to really ask the best kinds of questions. I would say that, unless Bryce has a question.
Yeah, so I wanted to ask Austin, so when you're approaching this in a way that you're understanding time as is an illusion, and it sounds to me like you're basing that off of a number of thought experiments that you as Austin are able to rationally comprehend. If you were shown
experiments are an illustration of it.
As an illustration of it, yeah. And really, that's all that we can honestly do with time, because it's such a fickle concept, even in scientific literature. As far as I understand it, it's so woefully not understood. Sorry for misspeaking. So I wonder, if you were proposed with a different set of thought experiments, would that force you to change what you think about time being an illusion?
Well, the thought experiments aren't how I arrived at the conclusion. There's actually some work done on this. Max Tegmark is one, and I think I already said Calabi-Yau. The Calabi-Yau conjecture was another. So there actually is like research and math to support it. The thought experiment is just an illustration of it.
Okay, so it's kind of the mathematics that helps you actually come to the conclusion.
Yeah.
Okay. So I guess
I'm not a physicist either, so
Sure.
I might not be understanding everything about the mathematics, but insofar as how I understand it, that's kind of what they're suggesting, and it's definitely not the only theory out there.
Okay. Yeah. So the math. So instead of the actual thought experiment changing, it would have to be the mathematics that would change, or at least the interpretation of those mathematics that would convince you to change your mind about this.
Right.
Okay, that's fair. Yeah. Cool. We think that's awesome. I don't know. I think a belief like that is interesting. But we do have to be careful when we use specific words. We're talking about illusions and things like that, because a lot of people who don't understand the material as well can kind of take that and mean something completely different when they're talking about stuff like this. Like when they say time is an illusion, they say that everything is an illusion and we live in an illusory world. And, that's, I don't think that's what you're saying. But
no, I'm not doing a dive into hermetics here.
I don't know. What do you think about this, Bryce?
Yeah, I mean, it is quite an assertion, but unfortunately, there's just so little understood about the concepts of time and the concept of what constitutes illusion as opposed to constitutes existence outside of perception. And I don't know, it's bold, but unfortunately, it feels like the definitions of those terms are kind of breaking down, and it's really hard to really ascertain.
When I say illusion, it's more of like an optical illusion. Like, you could the optical illusions of perspective, where someone standing in front of the Tower of Pisa, it looks like they're holding it up. Something more akin to that. Like if the ant was being moved across the two-dimensional, or he's moving across the two-dimensional background, he would have a reference for time, and it would appear to him as though time was moving, even if he was actually in a space that was timeless. He could use the frames of reference.
Okay,
I think that's fair. So if time were to exist, so say that we could set up a camera that has nobody viewing it whatsoever. Just this camera is only taking in information, and it is taking the reference point of me looking over, picking up my phone and holding it up to the camera and then putting it back down. That camera is viewing the progression of events through time the same way that my eyes are, regardless of whether or not a person actually watches the footage. Does that, because it's existing in this time-space or the space-time continuum where we know a progression of events of me looking down, picking up my phone, holding it up, and then setting it back down, those are the events, that's the amount of time it takes. If the camera itself is viewing all of those things and the footage on that camera exists outside of any actors, outside of any sentient or conscious actors, is it still therefore an illusion?
No, I wouldn't. Is what an illusion? Is the film on the camera the illusion?
Yeah, absolutely.
No, I wouldn't say that.
So then would that provide enough of an example for you to conclude that time is not an illusion then?
No, because the camera, I might not be thinking about your analogy correctly, but from the way I see it is the camera is also filming something in a three-dimensional space.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, say if you were to move up to the fourth dimension, then it would sort of stretch out everything in the third dimension. You would see kind of a tail behind it of all of its past states. So you would basically move out of three-dimensional time. And if there was a dimension higher than the fourth dimension, then there would be a fourth dimensional time.
So let me propose another thought experiment then in this case.
Yeah,
so
let's try to wrap it up in the next couple of minutes as well.
Okay, so by this logic then, we're all existing by this consideration a four-dimensional graph. The universe is a four-dimensional graph, and we are all existing at some point on that. So if I could transport it, let me just tell me if this is a correct thought experiment based on your understanding of time. If I could transport myself instantaneously right now from where I am to where the Earth was, somewhere on the Earth was 20 minutes ago in our four-dimensional space-time graph here, then I would be traveling back in time and experiencing the world as it progresses through the next 10 minutes of the conversation that we just had. Is that an acceptable thought experiment by that logic?
Yeah, and I would say that would work as long as you were moving through the fourth dimension. If you try to do that in the third dimension, you would just go back to an empty space and suffocate. But if you were progressing through the fourth dimension, then yes, our time would appear as spatial.
Okay. Then let me ask, so this is all thought experiment. Is there anything that would falsify your current understanding of the way that time is experienced by
and I'm glad you
beings?
asked, because we've just recently discovered gravity waves or gravitational waves. And so a lot of this percolates, a lot of the extra dimensions and stuff from string theory and M theory percolates down from the idea that gravity is such a weak force. And the fix for that in string theory is that it's because it's spread out among all these dimensions. So conceivably, as our understanding of gravitational waves and our ability to measure them gets more refined, we would be able to confirm or falsify the existence of the higher dimensions.
Interesting.
Very interesting.
Very cool.
I'll be watching for a live science article on that when that article gets written.
Yeah, for sure. I've kept up on the gravitational wave stuff the past couple of years. It's been really interesting in those findings. I'll have to see how that correlates with our understanding of time. But Austin, this was a very cool conversation that was above most people's heads. But I appreciate you calling nonetheless. It was very good to talk to you.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yes, absolutely. Definitely call again if you have something else you want us to examine. But looks like we have one more call on our list tonight, and I'm happy to announce that it is actually about Mormonism, Bryce.
All right, awesome.
We get to talk about the thing that you're really, really knowledgeable in, and I'm really excited about that. So this is from Aaron in Michigan, and Aaron wanted to talk to us about the LGBT community in the Mormon Church. Aaron, how's it going?
Hello?
Hey, can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you fine.
Yeah, how's it going?
Oh, pretty good.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Tell us more about what you wanted to talk to us about.
Well, a little bit of backstory. I am transgender. I also dabble a little bit in writing for the ACA, and I have a comic strip that they are gracious enough to publish. Excuse me. We've had a recent, I don't want to delve too much into politics because of the nature of the show, but we've had a recent sort of a little mini blue wave here in Michigan. The Attorney General-elect made a comment about, people not liking the fact that she was openly gay and then kissed her wife on stage during her campaign acceptance speech. There's been there's a long history not complimentary of the treatment of the religious community against LGBTQ people, queer people. And, it was in 1978, I think, that the Mormon Church reversed its position on black people being in the hierarchy of the church. And I just wondered what Bryce's viewpoint was and what his knowledge was about the treatment of queer people from the Mormon Church. We had they were heavily against the proposition in California for gay marriage. One of my favorite science fiction authors, Orson Scott Card, is a Mormon who's very much against the LGBT community, and I just wanted to know his viewpoint, from a historical context, because obviously knows far more about the Mormon Church than I do, even though I still get occasionally missionaries stepping at my door. So.
Yeah, that's unfortunately, this is a subject that is really deep and requires a bit of understanding and information in order to understand where the church is today when it comes to LGBT plus issues. Now, what I will say as an overview of everything that will follow is that the only way to cause the church to change its bigoted stances against social issues is to continue to keep pressure on them. So you made the example of the race in the priesthood, giving the priesthood to people of color. And what that meant is before 1978, people of color just couldn't get to Mormon heaven. They were not allowed into Mormon heaven. They could only be sealed as servants, basically, and then not even necessarily sealed because they couldn't gain access to the temples. So what happened was there were protests at BYU against the BYU sports team. There was a threatening of the church's tax exemption status. There was a temple being built in Brazil that nobody was going to be able to go into because they weren't giving the priesthood to people of color, anybody that had any of the blood of Cain in them, as they called it. And eventually all of these issues came to a head and put enough pressure on the church that they could no longer hold the position. It was no longer tenable. And I believe that the same thing is coming with the church's stance on LGBT plus issues. And what I mean by that is the church has been openly bigoted against these things. Essentially, well, the the history of it is something I have never personally studied to any respectable depth. I will recommend people check out Mr. Atheist's YouTube channel because he has definitely dove pretty deep down that rabbit hole of LGBT plus issues with the church. And he has a video series that talks about the history of it that I think is important to understand it within context.
Cool.
But the point is that the church has funded a string of anti-gay marriage bills. There have been as many as 30 bills that they have funded. Proposition 8 in California just happened to be the most public and the most costly one for them, and costly as far as money and PR goes. But recently the church released what we know as the November exclusion policy. This was November of 2015, which was leaked initially, and then the church came out with a stance, an official public statement that said any children of gay parents cannot be members of the church. Sorry, one second. So what that means is that in order to be an accepted member of the church, you would have to turn 18 years old and then renounce your parents if they were gay, and then you could be a fully, accredited member of the church. And it's just known as the November exclusion policy. And what that reveals is that this church is led by a gerontocracy that grew up during the Great Depression and the Red Scare. And everything that we know and hate about our culture today is ensconced in the leadership of the church and in their mind. And in order for them to be dragged kicking and screaming into the 21st century, we just got to keep the pressure on them. We just have to keep pushing them.
Right. It's kind of ironic when you started talking about the date that it was in November because that's Transgender Awareness Month, and the 20th is the National Day of Silence. We've had almost 400 transgender people in the last 25 years or so that have been killed purely because they're transgender. And I can't say with absolute certainty that every single one of those almost 400 was due to religion, but I can say that I would put a paycheck on at least 350 of them. If we had been, cishet females and males, because it has been some trans males too, there'd be an FBI investigation, there'd be a task force, there would be psychologists studying this, whatever. But because we are who we are, because we're such a heavily marginalized community, nobody cares. Nobody in officialdom, nobody cares. Or very few people care. I mean, that's changing in some respects. It's not enough. Like I said, almost 400 of us have been killed purely for being transgender, and that comes across in bathroom bills and anti-marriage laws and all these other statutes, and I work for a company. I don't really want to name the name, but you could call it Big Blue Box Mart. And 3 years ago, they changed their insurance policy so that it specifically encouraged and paid for hormone replacement therapy. I guess would say mental therapy, therapeutic sessions, and surgery for transgender people. And about a decade ago, I was working for a local hospital here. And Michigan is often called, derided accurately, as the south of the north. And when they found out that I was transgender, this is when I was just coming out to the public at large, they literally changed the insurance policy that next year to bar anything to do with transgender people. Because, I got a employee handbook every year, and the previous year had no mention of it. And the following year, it mentioned that, it wouldn't pay for surgery, it wouldn't pay for hormones or hormone replacement therapy, and it wouldn't pay for therapy. And I thought the third one was kind of ironic, considering that in order to know that the therapy regarded transgender issues, they would have to break HIPAA laws. They'd have to break federal law. But it was a job I had to do at the time. I had to feed myself and keep a roof over my head. And I had just come from being homeless in part because of issues like that. And so I had to do what I had to do to survive. And unfortunately, that's still the situation that we find a lot of transgender people in nowadays. You have Jazz Jennings, and you have Laverne Cox, and you have all these other people who are famous and who are, and I think that they're role models, and I think that they give the transgender community a lot of hope. But you also have people who don't look like Jazz, who don't look like Laverne, who get accosted every day, who get discriminated against on the basis of, there are transgender Christians. And
yes.
I to me, that's kind of like Jews for Hitler, but they have their belief system, and when someone says, well, my God says X, Y, and Z, it stuns me that, this country, which is supposed to be founded on law and equality for everyone, has religion so ensconced in the fabric of our society that it's second nature. In the atheist community,
yeah.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say you're touching on something that hits really personal with something I experienced when I was in Christianity and in student ministry and stuff, of the treatment of LGBT peoples. And if I had a nickel for every single time I saw transphobic, homophobic remarks being made by the people I was working with, I'd be rich. I wouldn't do stuff like this. Because I'd be living off in a mansion. Probably not that extreme, but you get the idea. I honestly wish that religious individuals, Christian or otherwise, knew how much they contribute to the LGBT homelessness in this country. Because atheists are generally not kicking their kids out for being gay or for being trans. It's really just not a thing. And it frustrates me to no end to see that this is not a moral issue in the way that they frame it. This is a human issue that has come about strictly because of the discrimination faced by these folks in this country. And I'm a younger person, right? So my voice isn't as loud on this because most people my age agree with me. Really, it's the people who have been in power and who are making these policy decisions and who are leading the churches that they preach at with these messages and this rhetoric that promotes this kind of discrimination that really, really frustrates me because I don't have to be LGBT to know that the stuff that they're saying is offensive and is quite hurtful to a lot of people. And it's something it's hard for me to even talk about because I just know a lot of people in my personal life that it has personally affected as well. And as you mentioned, trans and just LGBTQ Christians do exist and try so hard to reconcile their identity with their religious identity, with their sexual orientation, that feel like that they can't because there's people that are just not letting them have that. And God, like they won't even let these people try. You know, they just rather think that they don't exist or frame it in some sort of language they can understand. So, yeah, I get that.
The suicide rate among trans youth is still high as hell. And there's a lot of times that I think, and it's purely anecdotal, I can't, I don't have the data at least in front of me to back it up, but there's a lot of times I think that young people who have committed suicide that, some their family members or whatever claim, oh, we don't know why they did it. They do know why they did it. They want to hush it up, or they didn't leave a note, but it's obvious to their family, or it's obvious to some of their friends.
Yes.
And then you have people like the AFA and other religious organizations that use that statistic against us and say, oh, well, look at the LGBT community.
Yes.
Their suicide rate is so high.
Yes.
Well, in part, it's because, when you are a different nature and you get discriminated against, where I could still be fired. The company that I work for, and I've been there for almost 6 years, the company that I work for could fire me tomorrow because I'm transgender, and there's nothing I can do legally.
Yeah.
Well, Aaron, let me add in something else about Mormonism that really exhibits why this is such an issue within Mormonism and within many different faith traditions. Mormonism has something that they call worthiness interviews. And what those are, every local congregation is led by a bishop or a branch president. And that bishop has what Mormons call the power of discernment to know whether or not you're lying. He has a power from God to discern whether or not a person is telling the truth in front of them. And for every person growing up in the church, you have regular milestones throughout your youth and teenage years where you meet with the bishop, and you have to make sure that you are living a righteous life and that you are indeed worthy and not deserving of punishment of some kind because of the way that you're living. And what that means is you go to your bishop and you confess everything that you do. And these are regular intervals. You get them when you're 8 years old, when you are about to get baptized. You get them at 12 years old, and every 2 years after that at least. And what ends up happening is because anything that is not seen as, or that is not cis hetero is seen as sexual deviancy. And anyone who is seen as a sexual deviant, read a member of the, somebody who's LGBTQ plus, then they usually have more regular intervals for their worthiness interviews, where instead of every 2 years, they might meet every year or every 6 months or every 3 months if they're really, quote unquote, struggling with their unnatural attractions. So what that creates is an entire culture where people who are LGBTQ plus are deathly afraid of going to talk to their bishop because they know that punishment awaits if they're honest about the way that they feel about their own biology. If they confess their sins, then the bishop tells their parents, then everybody in the ward knows, and then they can't take the sacrament anymore, or they are disfellowshipped, or they're excommunicated, and they have to go through the missionary lessons and get rebaptized into the church again and start over at square one. So for all of those reasons, within Mormonism, they also have an extremely high LGBT plus teen suicide rate because it's an extremely oppressive and pernicious system that is specifically created to squash out those same-sex attractions, as they call them. They talk about it like a sickness. They say somebody has same-sex attraction instead of somebody is gay. They have a bunch of code words for all of the terms, and it's very disgusting.
You're bringing me back, Bryce. You're bringing me back to my days in ministry where this was the language we were encouraged to use to talk about these issues. They never talk about it directly, usually. They usually just let the language come first. and then you're kind of just supposed to adopt that, you know.
Yep.
And
You
and,
get to view the world through the framework that they provide you. Yep.
yes, and
Exactly, Dan. And you know, when you were talking about your experience, you know, when Bryce also said that, it reminded me, you know, I grew up, you know, Janet and I have talked about this many times. I grew up for the first 35, I'm almost 60. For the first 35 years of my life, I was a fundamentalist Pentecostal Assembly of God Christian, speaking in tongues, laying on hands, anointing with oil, passing out Jack Chick tracts. We literally had bonfires on Sundays where we would burn rock records. We had Bible study Wednesday, Friday, and then Sunday night after church on Sunday morning. You know, and so I graduated in '78. So there was no way, I knew that I was different when I was about 7. And there was no way that I could come out with any sort of, not even talking acceptance, safety in that community. I mean, I've literally been beaten and left bloody on the side of the road for dead because of who I am. And, you know, I it's kind of ironic for me to bring it up, but it was, you know, it was almost like a tale of the Good Samaritan. This older couple stopped by, saw me on the road bleeding. I was half conscious, pulled me into their car. I got blood over the back seat, took me to the hospital, got me set up, you know, with you know, an ER and whatever. You know, stayed long enough, you know, to make sure I was okay. You know, but by that time I was starting to come around and whatever, you know, stayed to make sure, very rural area, stayed to make sure that I was okay and whatever. To this day, I still don't know who they are. I don't know what their name is. You know, many cars just drove by. You know, they didn't want to stop. They didn't want to do anything. And that especially during that time frame was not an uncommon occurrence.
yeah, I cannot imagine what it was like to live in 1978 and being a trans person, and it's unreal. It's unreal. And the fact that we're even able to have conversations like this, I think, is a sign of progress. But
I agree. I've had multiple suicide attempts from the resulting depression. I have. You know, I was married twice. I went into military service to try to prove myself a man, which obviously I failed miserably. I was married twice. I've got 2 biological children, and that oppression and suppression is so deep, and the Stockholm syndrome, which is basically to some extent what I suffered, was so deep, and I hid myself for so long and hated myself for so long that, you know, to this day, I've been out for quite a while now, quite a few years now, and to this day, when I look in the mirror, there's a lot of times I still hate what I look like. I still hate who I am.
Yeah,
and that's something that I don't know if that's ever going to go away.
Aaron, I just give me just a second, because I want to take a second to tell you the way that I'm seeing this right now. And what I will say is that so often I make the argument that people who come out of the church for whatever reason, they're often branded like they had a bad experience, that's why they leave. But what is really the case at issue is that people who leave the church often leave because they are mad at the system as it's constructed, because the system has oppressing them because they've had thoughts that do not conform, because they do not fit a specific gender or social or sexual role that they have been taught their entire lives that they need to fill. Oppressed somehow. And we need to take a second to step back and understand that it's the system, the way it's constructed, that causes this pain.
Yes.
That caused you, Aaron, to go through what you went through. And unfortunately, it feels so good to say that person with that face over there hurt me, therefore I blame them. It's very cathartic for human beings to blame somebody else. But unfortunately, there's no single person who is at fault for what you and for what millions of LGBT plus people experience every single day. There is no single person at fault. It's not even the president of our country that's at fault, as much as we want to blame somebody like that.
Yes.
It is the entire system that is completely broken, that requires a massive overhaul, a massive repair. So on behalf of the entire system, if I can say that, Aaron, please understand that we are so sorry that you went through what you've gone through. That, like Dan and I, we can never understand that. And I want to sincerely thank you, Aaron, for being open and for sharing this and for showing all of us that bigotry has real world impacts and that people are hurt every single day by others and by themselves because of the way that our culture views sexuality and LGBT plus issues. So Aaron, just thank you for being open and for sharing so much. And I hope that now you're in a place where you have a community that you can talk to, where you have people that will listen to you, people that will feel your pain, and people that will resonate with what you say and can sympathize and empathize with you and say the right things when you need to hear them.
Yes, thank you so much for your call, Aaron. We really appreciate it.
Well, thank you. Just one last real quick thing. I do have a physical community. You know, a lot of my family is very supportive now. And, you know, I have some friends at work, and then I also have people online like John, I don't know how to pronounce his last name, Coletti, whatever, from the ACA, Janet especially, who get me. And it's important that with people like that, when they publicly support you, not just privately, but when they publicly support you, it makes a world of difference, let me tell you.
Yes. Yeah, for sure.
That's awesome.
That's really
so
great. Well, thank you so much again, Aaron. I hope to hear from you again soon. And thank you so much again just for sharing all of that. And I know that it only gets better when people like you share your stories and are really honest and brave about what you've gone through. So you're doing a real service by talking about this. So thank you again.
Well, thank you. I love the ACA. I love the show, and keep up the good work.
Thanks. Appreciate it. Let me tell you something real quick, Bryce. And this is something I've always thought about. If I was ever convinced to be a Christian again, and I'm open to that opportunity, I really am. But if Christianity became true in my mind, whatever that means, the first thing I am going to do is to fix what the Christian community has done to the LGBT community, because it is a goddamn mess. And I hate it. I hate everything I've ever seen come out of it. Even the most positive things that have come out of it. The Gay Christians Network, for example, is riddled with all kinds of systemic problems like you were talking about that just doesn't go away. That LGBTQ Christians have to face the same problems that they do in their lives, even if they share the same beliefs as other people with everything else. It doesn't make any sense. And that's what bigotry is right there. It's taking people and dividing them up into these categories of these in and out groups, even if they share every single other value that they share with you, even if they're in the same communities at the same jobs, it doesn't matter. If they have that one feature or trait that you just can't wrap your head around, then somehow that justifies discrimination in some form. And what's most criminal is when you don't call it discrimination, when you call these policies separate. Oh, this isn't a real marriage, right? This is a civil union or something else, right? Oh, this isn't a Christian marriage. This isn't a biblical marriage. I don't give a shit. I really don't. What you're doing is you're dehumanizing people. You're trying to take people separate from yourselves because you can't see them in the same light. You think that somehow, some way, the way that you do things is better. And that's just, it's frustrating. It really is. Yeah, I try to be as neutral and positive as I can on this show, but like LGBTQ stuff, and how that operates within religious communities just really fires me up. It doesn't make any sense, and it's really shameful.
Simply categorically disagree with you, Dan, because it makes perfect sense in my mind.
Because
it's so much easier to have an us and them when you're able to demonize and dehumanize the them.
Yeah.
Them, they are coming to change your world. They are coming to redefine marriage. They are trying to turn your kids gay. They are doing they are sexual deviants. They. But us true Christians, we know what the Bible says, and we conform to what real Christianity is.
Yeah.
Let me tell you what real Christianity is now that I have your ear. That is why it makes perfect sense to me. It's powerful. It is the tribalism. The tribes have balkanized. They have always balkanized. They are in their little camps, and it's a lot easier to keep your camp together when you have a common enemy. And it so happens that right now that is the LGBT plus people, that is immigrants, that is whoever it needs to be to galvanize the people. And it is abhorrent. It is shameful. It is disgusting that human beings are still engaging in this primitive tribalism. It doesn't matter where you live. It exists. It's happening.
Yeah. Yeah. It's unfortunately a problem that hasn't been solved. And that's something that I think comes up. It's like, oh, gay people can get married now. What's the big deal? No, that doesn't mean the discrimination still isn't there. That doesn't mean the judgments still aren't there in people's minds. It's ridiculous to think that just because the legal rights that are given means that the social implications of that are still the same. And by the way, America is not the only country in the world. You know, there's still places on Earth where you can be killed for being gay, and still happens every single month, I imagine. I don't know if it's every day, but it happens a lot, okay?
Every day.
You know,
every day.
It probably every day.
Every day,
probably
somewhere in the world. People get killed for, not being cis hetero. People get killed for not believing, for speaking out in opposition to a religious or a government system. Happens every day. So let's just say humanity has a lot of things that don't conform to what humanity should be in our minds. But unfortunately, we all seem to have different ideas of what humanity should be. And that's where so many conflicts are generated, isn't it?
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so this got really, really personal and really emotional today, but I'm glad that we had this conversation because it's important and it needs to be happening. So we are going to be wrapping up the show, but not quite yet. So Bryce doesn't actually know this yet, but for the next couple minutes in this sort of after show portion, he will be taking some questions from some people in the chat for a few minutes. And so if you want to see that content and you're looking at this on the regular YouTube channel, this is going to be available as special Patreon content for Truth Wanted. So you should definitely go subscribe to the Patreon if you are interested in that.
Do it.
Yes.
Do it. Support this man. Keep this show going.
You hear that? Bryce says you have to support it, so he's the authority here. That's what that means. Okay, so just to kind of wrap things up, go ahead and subscribe to this channel if you haven't already. We are also available on Spreaker and iTunes if you like the audio forms instead. Again, we are also on Patreon, Patreon/Truth Wanted. If you want to help support this show and the ACA and other shows like it, go ahead and go there. Next week, we will be trying to get Thomas Westbrook from Holy Kool-Aid in studio as my guest. So look forward to that. I think it's going to be a really fun conversation. Bryce, where can people find you at?
Yeah, so I'm most known for being the dude who talks about Mormon history and an insufferable windbag. You can find that on Twitter, Facebook, and your favorite podcasting app of choice at Naked Mormonism, the serial Mormon history podcast. And of course, Dan, just thanks for having me. I had a lot of fun today. Thank you.
Yes. I hope you can come back on again. This was a really good time.
Absolutely.
So anyway, we are going to go ahead and close out the show. If you're still live, keep live because we're going to be answering some questions here. But if you're watching this online, thanks for watching. We'll see you next time. Remember, always keep wanting the truth. Thanks again, everybody. We'll see you again.